Do you have to be really strong to use a 4-cycle trimmer, or is it that I'm out of shape? I was given this trimmer so that I could do its yearly maintenance, and while working on it I realized just how heavy it really was. These are supposed to be easier to use, but with it weighing a lot, I find that hard to believe. Now before I work on it, I want to weigh it and see if my guess was right. That you have to be a fit person to use one of these, otherwise you're not going to use it for very long. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Troy-Bilt 4-cycle string trimmer, and the problem is that we need to do its yearly maintenance, that way it'll be ready for the mowing season. Otherwise, you risk wearing out the machine faster than normal, or worse yet, you end up damaging the machine. Now, I'm going to try and repair this string trimmer, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now this machine looks to have been well kept, and come to find out this one was donated to them and now they're just using it as a backup trimmer. But even as a backup, they understood the importance of good maintenance, which means they want their stuff to last no matter how well it was built. Now a lot of consumers who've had experience with these might argue about their build quality, but the one thing they can all agree on is how much it weighs. For something that you're supposed to hold with your hands for 10 to 30 minutes, you'd think they would have made it just a little bit lighter. So just how much does it weigh then? Now for convenience, I'm only going to weigh the engine part, and it's a good thing I did too. So as you can see, just the engine portion weighs a massive 12.4 pounds, which is what some entire trimmers weigh. Now to be fair, I'll weigh a typical trimmer attachment, that way we can compare it apples to apples. And as you can see, it too is a hefty 3.4 pounds, which means this trimmer, once put together, is just shy of 16 pounds. I don't know about you, but I don't like the idea of holding this trimmer for any longer than I need to. Now before we try and start this thing, we need to check and see if we have enough oil in it. I know it's tough to see, but there is oil in it, and it's just below the lip, which should be enough for at least a test start. Now fortunately, the sticker that tells us how to start this engine is still on here, but I will let you know these instructions worked well when the machine was brand new, but once these get some time on them, you might have to modify the instructions to get them to start. So as you just saw, the kill switch was not working on it, and I had to short the terminals to get it to stop. Now if you don't want to do it the way I did it, you could always close the choke to get the engine to stop, but I'm not a fan of that technique. So we know the switch is a problem, so we can either replace it or we can try to make it work. And since it's already a problem, we're not going to lose anything if we try and fix it. Now I should have emptied the oil before taking off the rear cover, but I also wanted to shorten these fuel lines too. But before disconnecting these lines and taking off the tank, I want to confirm which line is which. So it turns out the straight brass port is the return line, while the curved brass port is for the filter line. Now if you have the same model trimmer, then it should be the same, but if yours isn't the same model, then I can't guarantee that yours is going to be the same. Now the fuel line was stuck to the port on the carb, so I had to cut it, which is just fine since we need to shorten this line anyway. Now I did consider replacing the fuel lines out of courtesy, but because the fuel lines are in great condition and they only use 100% gasoline, it should last for quite some time. Now this engine oil wasn't terrible, but when it only needs about 3 ounces of oil, each oil change is really cheap insurance. Next up is the all-important valve clearance check, and I'm going to phrase it that way because you only need to change it if it's out of tolerance. Now you don't need to take out the spark plug to do this, but it does make it a bit easier to turn the engine over. I'm also going to check the air gap on the spark plug while we have it out. So I like to set my air gap to 25 thousandths of an inch, but you're welcome to set it to whatever value you want. This one is a bit loose, so I'll give it a slight tap on the table, but that's when I noticed what brand it was. So this is an aftermarket spark plug, and I'm not fond of them, and the main reason why is that I like and prefer to use OEM plugs if possible. Now, I'm not saying that I wouldn't install an aftermarket plug because in a pinch they'll work, I just don't care for their quality. Now, we did have this engine running earlier, and I want to check and make sure that it's not hot when checking the clearances. And it turns out this engine has cooled down since then to about ambient temperature. After taking off the valve cover, we can now see the two rocker arms. Next, we'll rotate the engine until one of the arms is all the way down while the other is loose. We'll then check the clearance for the one that's loose, and for me, I'll be using a 5/1000 feeler gauge to help out. I'll then slide the feeler into the clearance and see how it fits, and this one is close, but it is just a bit too loose. Now, since it is so close, I'll just move up one shim size to the 6/1000 feeler, and come to find out it just barely fits, which means that's what the clearance is for this arm. Next, I'll rotate the engine again and do the same process but for the other arm, but this time it turns out the 5/1000 feeler fits perfectly. Now technically we don't need to make any adjustments, but I'll show you the process with the first rocker arm. After rotating the engine back so that the arm is loose again, we'll then turn the adjusting nut clockwise a tiny amount and then check the clearance. That turned out to be just enough to get the clearance back to where it needs to be. We'll then replace the valve cover, but we've got one more thing we need to do, not as part of maintenance, but out of curiosity. Before we install the spark plug, this would be a great time to do a compression test. The tester will measure how much pressure the engine can make, and the higher the reading, the better. We also need to use an adapter for the spark plug opening since it's not the standard size. Now, if you're planning on getting one of these, I would recommend that you get one with all the adapters. That way, you'll be prepared if something like this should happen to you. So the reading was a very disappointing 72 psi, which is not a good reading. What this means is that the engine has quite a bit of wear on it, or the valves are having a tough time sealing. Now since it does start and run, it just means it'll be down on power. So what would cause this sort of wear on an engine? Well, the best answer would be running the engine low on oil. The other reason would be not allowing the engine to warm up before using it. Unfortunately, the way the instructions have you starting the engine probably doesn't help out. I would recommend not revving the engine until it's had at least a minute to idle, and only then would I say that you could use it. While we're here, I'm also going to check the spark arrestor screen for a buildup of carbon, but as you just saw, there was almost no carbon on it, which is pretty amazing. Now, even though this is a 4-cycle engine, I would not recommend running without a spark arrestor screen. The reason why is because it would increase the risk of fire by a small percentage, which is something you don't want to do. After adding the oil back to the engine, we'll then start to put it back together, and then we'll look at the kill switch. Now, you can find these switches for as little as $7 before taxes, but that is one meant for this machine. However, a universal 2-prong momentary rocker switch will work just fine, but you might just have to buy them in bulk. But for the same price, you'll end up with 5 switches instead of just one, and I guess we'll just have a bunch of extras on hand. Once the rear cover is back on, we can then reconnect the fuel lines to the carb. Remember that the filter line connects to the curved brass port while the return line goes to the straight one. Now, even though both lines are a bit too long, the return was the longest one. Once the lines are connected, we'll then confirm that fuel is flowing through the lines like they're supposed to. So when pressing on the bulb, fuel should come up the filter line into the carb, fill the bulb, and then leave the carb through the return line and back to the tank. And as you can see, fuel is flowing exactly the way it's supposed to. Now, if the fuel is flowing the other direction, then you might have installed the lines backwards. The engine will start, but because the lines are backwards, the carb will clog with debris after some time. Next, we'll carefully pry the top part of the switch off the base. So what happens most of the time is that the piece of metal inside the switch will not make contact with the other terminal. And the best way to deal with it is to clean the switch and also reshape the metal piece so that it makes better contact. If you have a multimeter to test the switch, that would be a better way to test it other than trial and error. After getting the metal piece out, we'll then spray some brake cleaner into the body and then try to clean it the best we can. I'll then slightly bend the curved end of the metal piece and then install it. Now, if you don't want to go through the hassle of cleaning the switch, then just buy a new one. Like I said earlier, if you don't want to go through any of this hassle, then just use the choke to stop the engine. But using the choke could cause the engine to flood with extra fuel and make starting it again a bit tougher to do. After that, carefully install the top part back onto the switch and snap it into place, and then we'll start the trimmer and test it out. So it did take a couple of attempts to stop it, but that was because I wasn't able to press on it with a lot of force. But after getting the switch back into place, it worked just fine. I also need to lubricate the trimmer head gearbox because it's not wanting to spin as freely as it should. The only problem is that this particular one is not serviceable, which means I'll have to take it apart to do that. So it was very obvious that someone was taking good care of this machine at some point. And that means my only guess would be a non-existent warm-up period as to the reason why it's a bit worn out. That's okay though, it lasted this long with good maintenance, and with yearly upkeep it should still work fine for several more years. The only change that I would make would be the addition of a shoulder strap just to keep the weight off the arms. So that brings us to the main problem with this heavy machine, which is its heavy maintenance requirements. Now, even though I'm able to do it, would a different consumer want to or even be able to? Now, to be honest, I don't think it was even a consideration when they were brainstorming this idea, but that's an argument for a different day. So my question is, would you want to deal with the problems that come along with a 4-cycle trimmer? To be honest, I like simple, and this is not my definition of simple.
Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.